Hello, welcome to the BostonHMIS Universal Data Element Definition Training. My name is Jennifer Flynn. I am the HMIS Administrator for the Boston Continuum of Care at the City of Boston Department of Neighborhood Development. This training is not meant to be a step-by-step how to collect data in your HMIS front-end system. This training is meant to go over the required data elements from HUD and all other federal partners for HMIS data collection for homeless clients that you serve in your programs. And also some special considerations as you are interviewing these clients and how to ask some of these questions. Universal data elements are required by all HMIS participating programs regardless of funding source. They're basically the building blocks of a client record. They're the basic demographic information about a client that doesn't change. It enables us to create unduplicated client records in our HMIS data warehouse, and it's the foundation of the annual homeless assessment report, which is delivered to Congress every year, and then Congress uses that to determine homeless funding levels. Also important to note that all HMIS responses are client self-reported. Here's a complete list of the universal data elements that are required to be captured. Some of these are data elements, again, that are captured once for your client at the agency, and not, again, they're information that doesn't change about a client unless you happen to enter it wrong. So name, social, date of birth, race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status. Other universal data elements can change over time depending on a client's program enrollment and their situation at the time of that program enrollment. These universal data elements are disabling condition, their project start and end dates, the destination of where they went to when they left the program, what type of a household situation they're in and where they fit in that household, which COC they're located in for the delivery of these services, when they moved into housing, not necessarily permanent housing, and where was their living situation the night before they entered this program. On the following few pages are charts that were pulled directly from the HMIS Data Standards Manual, which describe each element for which clients it's to be collected for and at which point during their enrollment. The charts display both the universal data elements and program-specific data elements, which we'll go over in a separate training. So again, here we have each data element as they're listed. Which clients are we capturing this for? All clients, only heads of household, only adults, and then when are we collecting them? When we first create a record, when they come into a program, anytime we meet with the program, updated because things have changed, annual assessments, and it exits. It's important to note in annual assessments, particularly projects that are funded by a federal program and must report an annual progress report or a CAPR. Clients that are in a program for 1 year or longer must have an annual assessment done within 30 days of their anniversary date. The annual assessment collects information about income, benefits, sources, and health insurance. So again, page 2, from here on, the income and sources, these are program-specific data elements, again, that we will go over in a separate training. Name. It is very important to capture the client's full legal name as much as possible. As many of you now have access in window into the warehouse access, you can see how clients frequently move between shelters and programs, and the differences, slight as they may be, in capturing a client's name in order to create one record in the warehouse. It's much easier to locate William Smith with the same birth date as opposed to a Bill Smith. So again, be mindful of attempting to collect their full legal names. Same on, and be sure to capture the correct data quality points as well. If it is their full name reported, if they only gave you a partial name, they're refusing, or they don't know. Important to note for clients who refuse data collection, We ask that you make every attempt to still enter this client into HMIS and complete a full HMIS assessment on these clients. Again, capturing all other information about them. However, entering them in as anonymous first name, anonymous last name, with no dates of birth or social security numbers. This allows us to still capture the relevant information about a client for aggregate city reporting for policy and planning purposes. It allows your program to report on that client, especially if you have to report an APR for them. However, it does allow the client to maintain their privacy and not have their identified information entered into the HMIS system. It is important to note that you should make sure that you have a way to associate that anonymous client in HMIS with the actual client's record at your agency, you know, their paper files, your progress reports, your full kind of record on them. Social security number and date of birth. Again, if a client is refusing or they don't know their social or they don't have one, please select the appropriate quality code and then enter in 9s as the 9-digit number. For date of birth, if they're refusing or if they're giving you an approximate, we ask that you enter in their birth date as a January 1st and then approximate a year of birth based on their age so that we can have some fairly consistent, more accurate reporting. Race and ethnicity, which will be on the next few slides, are very difficult questions for some populations, in particular Hispanics. Race and ethnicity are federally required data elements that must be captured. It is important to note that, again, these are client self-reported information. For race, a client may select all that apply. HUD has given you nice little descriptions here for really what each race means. On the next couple of slides, you'll see some special considerations and a note from HUD regarding the capturing of ethnicity and race, in particular for Hispanic clients. So Hispanic clients, according to federal guidelines, are persons of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin, regardless of their race. In many circumstances, a Hispanic person will identify their race as Hispanic and not wish to identify a secondary race on top of that. This slide here is direct language straight from HUD's HMIS Data Standards Manual regarding some interview questions that you may ask for, again, especially Hispanic clients in determining a race along with their ethnicity. I am going to read directly from HUD's guidance for this. This is from the race section of the HMIS manual. So, this data element can be challenging to separate from ethnicity. As one example, some people of Latin American descent often indicate their race as Hispanic and would not be referred to in casual conversation or seen in the community or by themselves as white or Black African American. Unless the person is from an original peoples group, that is indigenous or American Indian, in which case they would select that option, the staff will have to ask follow-up questions to ascertain the best response for race. Staff may ask something like, do you know if your ancestors were originally from a country like Spain, somewhere in Africa, or are you part of an indigenous group? This response is then tied to where their ancestors came from and not necessarily where they were born or if they've lived during their lifetime. By the time clients get to data element 3.5 ethnicity, they may have already responded to race with something like Hispanic, Guatemalan, or Latino. So staff should be able to clearly distinguish between these two elements and select responses accordingly, even if the answers are provided out of order. Again, that's important to note. Some HMIS software vendors ask ethnicity before race, others ask race before ethnicity. Just be mindful that this is a sensitive question. However, it is also, very important for data quality, not only for planning and reporting purposes, but on overall data quality, which then affects the COC's application to HUD for funding every year. So we really do ask that case managers make the the attempt to get this information from clients. And again, I would much rather see a client refused or a client doesn't know option than just this question not being filled out. So those data quality codes are there for a reason. If a client is refusing or a client doesn't know their race over their ethnicity, please use those options. Gender. Gender is one of the few universal data elements that actually had a change in this standards update, and that was to add an additional response for gender nonconforming. Gender nonconforming means clients who do not identify exclusively as male or female. There are also small updates to the wording of the transgender female and the transgender male categories. The definition itself does not mean anything different. It is just a wording of the response category. It is important to note, again, that this is client identified, and it does not have to match legal documents. Something else important to note is that a client may opt to give different information about this sensitive category if it's a sensitive response to different agencies across the COC, and that is perfectly okay. Also, transgender clients may elect to share their transgender status or not. Basically, what this means is that trans male, who would be a female to a male, may opt to identify themselves as a trans male in HMIS, or they may opt to identify themselves strictly as male in HMIS. Again, this is all client self-reported. Veteran status. Please be mindful that there will be an additional short video training on how to document and verify veteran status for the Boston COC. This policy and procedure was developed by the Veterans Working Group, which consists of members of all or just about all of your agencies, both emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing, and transitional housing programs, as well as the VA. As this group meets weekly and have been meeting weekly for a number of years now, where they develop the by name list of veterans in the COC, the attempt to move them through the COC onto permanent housing. What is important to note here on veteran status is that you do not have to be VA eligible to be a veteran in HMIS. To be a veteran in HMIS, you only have to have served on active duty in the United States military. HUD gives a little bit more information about this here. So anybody in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard on active duty, reserves who were deployed at active duty, and if you were disabled in the line of duty. So again, please see the short video on documenting veteran status and when to include that in HMIS on the separate training. Disabling condition is one of the universal data elements that is used in order to determine a client's chronic homeless status. The definition of chronic homelessness is a client who is 18 years or older, has a disabling condition, and has either been continuously homeless in an emergency shelter or street outreach for 1 year or longer, or has had 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. It is important to note there are a number of disabilities that qualify for a disabling condition. These are physical, mental health, substance abuse, a developmental disability, HIV/AIDS, or a veteran who's been disabled by an injury or illness occurred during active military duty. On the next slide, we will go through a little more information, in particular around physical, mental health, and substance abuse. Again, it is important to note that this is client self-reported information, and because it is client self-reported information, it does not mean that it is a HIPAA data element. Also, programs may not collect this information as part of program admission unless information is needed to determine eligibility for appropriate accommodations. So when thinking about disabling condition in respect to a physical, mental, emotional impairment, or a substance abuse problem, the key to being a disabling condition for those three impairments is that it must also be expected to be of long continued duration and impedes the individual's ability to live independently. Those two qualifiers do not apply to a developmental disability diagnosed under age 22, HIV/AIDS, or if they're already receiving SSI, SSDI, or VA disability. Again, in order for a disabling condition to be yes in HMIS, for somebody who has a physical, mental health, or substance abuse problem, they must also have yeses to expected to be of long duration and impedes the ability to live independently. Project start and end dates, fairly self-explanatory. It is truly for a start date. It's the first time you've met with the client. First time they came for services in your program, first time they showed up for a bed. The special considerations for this are in your permanent housing programs and including the Rapid Rehousing Stabilization Program. The start date here should be the date the client has moved into housing or the lease update. The start date for a rapid rehousing pre-placement program should be the day that the client has agreed to housing and deemed eligible for the program. As many of you know, we've got folks that have been in emergency shelter for a long time and are very pre-contemplative about housing. Once that changes and a client has decided that they do want to move along the housing path and has decided to engage with the rapid rehousing program, that is the date of the start date for the pre-placement rapid rehousing program. And again, exit date is the last date that you have delivered a service or a bed to that client. It is important to note for emergency shelters that use a bed register, Boston's protocol is that a client is exited out of the program after their 30 days after their last bed stay. And that exit date should be the same date or the day after actually of that last bed stay. Client location is important in order to allow your HMIS system to pull the correct clients for your COC when running reports. Again, I don't think you're going to run into this too much because we are requiring programs to be set up separately for different COCs. So ideally, the client in your program should really only be in the one COC. Again, Boston COC code is MA-500. It's important to enter this information exactly as it is because most HMIS software systems will not allow extra digits or certain characters. The housing move-in date, again, should be the actual date of move-in or lease up for a client. This is not necessarily for a permanent housing program. A client can move into any type of housing program, yet still be active in your other program. Right. This probably is going to come into play a lot more with the rapid rehousing programs and services only programs that are affiliated with housing. Also, just services only programs that may not be affiliated with housing, but are still delivering some services to clients. It's important to capture that move-in date into a housing situation from either their streets or the emergency shelter. Living situation. So the intent to collect this data element is truly where did you stay last night before you came into this program? HUD has the HMIS data elements have now been broken out into a little bit of a situations bucket on top, as well as the actual destination living situation category. So the homeless situations are place not meant for human habitation, emergency shelter, including hotel, motel, safe haven, and interim housing. It's important to note here for interim housing, and I'm going to read the full definition for you because this is a new option in living situation. and is truly only for certain types of programs and should only be used for certain clients. So interim housing is limited to use by PSH projects for which chronically homelessness is an eligibility criterion. A housing situation where a chronically homeless person has 1, applied for permanent housing, 2, they have been accepted into this housing, and 3, the unit or voucher is reserved for them, but there's something that's preventing them from moving into that housing now. So the situation may be, your client has gotten an offer from the BHA and they're going to move in the next month because there's, the current tenant's moving out and BHA has to repaint the apartment. So your client can't move in right now. But the next section is where it has been determined to be absolutely necessary to use this transitional housing / interim housing to keep the client engaged prior to moving into PSH. The client must be identified as coming from interim housing to preserve chronic identification and reporting purposes. This is not a substitute for a waiting list. So again, your chronically homeless client that has been living on the streets for 5 years and is extremely hard to engage, is extremely hard to find, they disappear a lot, but you finally engage them and you've got the hook into them, and now they've got their offer for BHA, but it's 2 weeks before they can move in. You don't want to lose them on the street again, so they go into this interim housing situation for those 2 weeks before they're able to move into their permanent housing placement. That is the only option, the only available clients, and the only programs which should be using interim housing as a living situation. So continuing on with living situation, on your left-hand side here, we've got some institutional settings where a client may be coming from into your program. Psychiatric hospital, substance abuse treatment, hospital, jail, prison, foster care home, long-term care facility. This section here are extremely important data elements and data responses for us to collect, as it's very important for discharge planning purposes with these other systems of care. Other situations a client may have been in, they've refused, they don't know, you haven't collected the data. Or they were in a transitional housing and permanent housing program. Transitional housing, the other federally funded programs have been crosswalked here for your mapping. Residential projects, hotels, family, friends, other permanent housing programs, subsidized housing, etc. These next questions are companion questions to the living situation, and it is attempting to do 2 things. First, they are attempting to figure out if there was a break in an episode. And then number 2, these questions are also HUD's attempt to be able to determine a client's chronic homeless status by using this HMIS data. It is important to note that the Boston COC generates their chronic list based on actual bed nights in the system and not the client self-reported data that you will find in an HMIS touchpoint or assessment in your system. However, even though Boston is not using this data to create our chronic by name list, programs must continue to collect this information for a number of purposes. One would be to identify clients who may be chronically homeless because their stays are between multiple COCs. And then 2, this data is important for programs that have to report an annual report to HUD or another federal program to quantify how many potentially chronic clients they're serving in their program. There is an additional flow chart on the next few pages that HUD has provided when asking these questions. So number 2 is length of stay in prior living situation. It is that immediate situation that we just described last time around. Is it 1 night, 2, 90 days or more, or a year or longer? Now moving on to these dependent fields. If they stayed 90 days or less, were they in an institution? If the answer is yes, This does not consider a break in an episode for a client. A client may maintain their continuous homeless status if they were in an institutional setting for less than 90 days. An example of that would be a client was either in the hospital for a 30-day stay or maybe in a jail for a short period of time, but they're going to be coming back into the program and we're not exiting them out. Second question for clients in a transitional or permanent housing program response: was your stay less than 7 nights? And again, that it constitutes a break for these transitional or other permanent housing situations. And then 3, on the night before, were you in a street or a safe street shelter or a safe haven? So again, if we think about what the chronic definition is that the client needs to be in a homeless situation on the streets or in shelter, which is this question C, and have 4 or more episodes in a 3-year period. These questions here, A and B, are meant to start helping to determine episode breaks. Moving on, so the date that their homelessness started, this can be approximate, and it should be a look back to when they were truly in a permanent housing situation for any continuous amount of time, not bouncing around to friends' couches, to friends' couch, to shelter, to couch surfing. It was a continuous where they were before they became homeless. Number of times a client has been on the street or in the shelter in the past 3 years. Again, thinking back to the chronic homeless definition, in order to be episodic chronic, you must have had 4 or more episodes in the last 3 years. And then total months of homelessness on the street or in the shelter: 1 month, more than 12 months, or you just enter in the actual number of months that the client has supplied to you. And again, in order to be determined to be chronically homeless, according to the definition, a client must have 12 months of homelessness in the past 3 years. So again, these are HUD's attempt to get client self-reported chronic status. However, Boston does not use client self-reported information in this calculation. We use our true HMIS bed nights and disabling condition questions. Here's a flow chart provided by HUD for the living situation questions for where you were and how long you were homeless for the chronic homeless status. Relationship to head of household. In HUD's last data standards update in 2014, they changed the classification of persons, right, from individuals and families to using this household nomenclature. So again, we have households without children, which in our regular common language would be single adults or individuals. Households with adults and children, which in common language would be families. And then we have households with only children, and in the common world, we would consider those juvenile parents. So they would be a mom or a dad under the age of 18 with a child, or they may be 2 unrelated under 18 youth who are presenting together. With HUD's change in this household nomenclature came a change in how to enter and enroll clients in HMIS. So all clients, even individuals, single adults who are presenting on their own, must be created as a household in your HMIS front-end system in order to have a household ID assigned to them. Each household must also have a head of household assigned. In the case where it is a single adult, that person is the head of household is the self. Household relationships are extremely important in reporting, especially on the family side, and when we report our annual reports. What is also important to note is that a household's composition may change during their program enrollment. And what that means is you may have a household with children, which would be a mom and a child, say pregnant mom and child. And during the course of the enrollment, pregnant mom gives birth. So now you've got to enter in a new client, the infant, and associate them now with this household. Their start date, both in the program and their start date in this household composition, would be their date of birth. So again, it's important to note that family composition will change as dynamics change in the household during a program enrollment. A client may also present in different program enrollments as different household types. You may have a client who at one point appears as a household without children at a single adult female shelter, and then a year later presents as a household with child at a family emergency shelter. So again, for the purposes of this assessment question, a household, single individual, group of persons who apply for services together. They do not necessarily need to be related. The head of household should be really thought of as, right, the primary client, who is the one that we're delivering the services to. There cannot be more one head of household at a time. However, there always has to be a head of household for each household in your HMIS. Destination. Destination is becoming an even more critical data element as HUD moves to system performance measures and tying funding to your performance measures and your outcomes. One of the system performance measures is your placement rates into permanent housing from all of your residential programs, and another is placements into any type of housing from a street outreach program. Destination has always been a challenging data element for us across the board. We would like, please be mindful, of clients as they move through your agency through programs. There are numerous times when we see a client exit an emergency shelter, then start a transitional housing program in the exact same agency, but their exit from emergency shelter is either blank or they don't know where they went to, when that client is literally in the room across the hall from them. So again, please be mindful of your data quality, knowing that there are going to be circumstances where you're unable to collect this information, and that is perfectly okay. But there are also times when that information should and must be collected and should be collected accurately. So again, as with living situations, destination has been bucketed out into types of situations. So the temporary situations are those homeless situations from earlier, place not meant from human habitation, shelter, safe haven, moving and HOPWA programs, transitional housing. Non-homeless temporary situations would be halfway houses, hotels or motels with voucher. Staying with family or friends temporarily. Is very important to note if somebody is going to be moving in with family or friends to distinguish if this is going to be a temporary situation, or as you'll see in the next slide, there are permanent situations as well. Institutional settings of psychiatric hospitals, substance abuse hospital, jails, prisons, foster care homes, and nursing facilities. A whole bunch of permanent housing situations. And again, we've got some crosswalks here with your federal funding source and component types in order to crosswalk these with the appropriate destination types. Rental by client with rapid rehousing subsidy, HOP or permanent housing for formerly homeless, other subsidies with some, a VASH subsidy and other ongoing subsidy, no subsidized housing, family and friends permanent. and then some other situations here of, deceased, other, no exit interview completed, data not collected. So a little more information on destination. Again, it's where is this client going immediately after exit from this program? As I said earlier, it's an important outcome measure for all of our reporting, in particular our system performance measures, which then impacts our federal funding. It's especially important to note for emergency shelters when they're exiting out clients that have not stayed in a bed in 30 days. You should be selecting no exit interview completed. It is going to be a missing data issue in some respects, and it will not be in others. HUD specifically has this guidance in the HMIS manual, and I will read directly from it. Mass shelters that track bed nights using the night-by-night method may have high rates of missing destination data when the client is exited. Often in this model, a client is exited after a period of time of not coming into the shelter, at which point the opportunity to ask clients where they are going is lost. HUD and other federal partners strongly encourage shelters, even large-scale shelters, to consider themselves to be a part of the community system working to end homelessness. Any steps these projects can take to establish relationships with clients, focus on moving clients into more permanent housing situations, or collaborate with service projects to do so will improve system functionality, data quality, and client outcomes. And again, in some certain HUD programmed reports, no exit interview completed is going to show as missing data. However, Boston and Boston specific reports are instructing our emergency shelters who exit clients out after no bed stays in 30 days to continue to collect this as no exit interview completed, and we are not looking at that as missing information. That is an appropriate destination for these types of programs. I will back you guys up on this. I'm putting this on my training video now. I've already had conversations with HUD about this being an appropriate destination for this model. In true emergency shelters, they are being used for an emergency. If somebody doesn't need a bed that night, they're not going to come back and tell you they don't need it. They're just not going to come back for it. Avoiding unintentional data quality issues and errors. Just some common mistakes to be careful of: ineligible writing on intake forms, clients misunderstanding the questions, inconsistent interpretation, language barriers. And on that note, we are working to have our documents translated into other languages for more ease of use for clients of different nationalities and with these language barriers. Other things to keep in mind, again, misspellings, use of nicknames and not legal names or aliases, transposing of numbers and dates of birth and start dates, accidentally selecting the wrong response, entering incorrect dates. And I will say that this probably the biggest issue where we see this is when you enter in a start date as somebody's date of birth. Then we end up having a whole bunch of really young children in adult emergency shelter programs. So this concludes the HMIS Universal Data Elements training. The website, HMIS data standards, can be found on this website. Any questions or concerns, you may feel free to contact myself, Jennifer Flynn, or Kadra Adderley, the HMIS coordinator, at the information below. Thank you.